and good afternoon to everyone who is joining our webinar from Myanmar. And firstly, introducing myself as Alisa. I'll be responsible for hosting this webinar today. And let me welcome you all to our webinar, Perspectives on Myanmar's Economy, and also the Myanmar's economy after the February 2021 coup. And thank you all for being with us on this webinar. So to discuss on this interesting topic, it's my honor to introduce our special guest, Professor Stephen Collinon, who is Ordinary Professor of Political Economy at Santa Ana School of Advanced Studies, PISA, since October 2007. He was also an international chief economics of the Central Europa, CER, Roma from 2007 to 2019. He is also the founder of Euro-Asia Forum at Santa Ana School of Advanced Studies. Previously, he was Continual Professor of European Political Economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, from January 2001 to 2005. During 2005 to 2007, he was a visiting professor at Harvard University, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Government Department, and an associate of the Minder Dell Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard. Since 2016, he has also taught at the Economics Department of Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. So, along with his experiences, Professor will also discuss Myanmar's current political and Myanmar's current economic struggles by comparing with international content. And this talk will last about 1.5 hours, and there will be a question and answer session at the end. So if you don't mind, please hold your question to the discussion time. So for your information, a recorded version of this webinar will also be available on YouTube as soon as possible. So it's time to start our webinar. I'm glad to welcome you again, Professor, to discuss today's topic.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity that we can discuss the Myanmar economy. Of course, you know much better than I do because you live there, how difficult the situation is and how much the situation has degraded. But we will look at this with some statistics and see what has been the international standard against which the present developments are. The Myanmar economy has experienced a very severe shock through the coup in February 2021. In many ways, it is going back to things that more than 20 years, in fact, and the consequences are pretty disastrous. We may look here at the perspectives, both from the long run and the short run. I look at GDP, I look at prices, I look at public finance, foreign trade and exchange a little bit as well. There would be a lot one could talk about, but I give you basically a bit of a macroeconomic perspective of what has been going on. So let us start with some of the long-run tendencies, because it's useful to see how the present situation is in the broader context of Myanmar's development. And in particular, we start out with the most basic things like population and employment, which is about the size and the growth of population. So you see that the total population is now a bit more than 50 million. But you see also that the population growth has pretty much come down since the 1980s. With a few variations, but in some ways, this is a good thing as well, because usually when population growth goes down, it is related and correlated with some form of economic progress and development. partly because people are working more, they're generating more wealth. So this is partially reflected also in the population growth, but it's still a fairly high rate. Now, when we look at the wealth of the nation, we need to always keep in mind it's created by people, and that of course means also how can they move, what can they do, and I come back to that at the very end of the lecture. But in economic terms, the important thing is the size and the quality of the labor force. And there we distinguish between the participation rate, meaning how many people out of the total population are actually participating in economic activity, whether it's in agriculture, in industry, in administration, or whatever. In developed economies, an important part is also the unemployment rate, but we will see that this is not really relevant in Myanmar because the ways of counting unemployment don't really exist. So it's more the participation rate that is important. And then when you look at those who are highly or those who are in employment, then the question is what is their productivity and what can they actually do? You see here the total labor force, and you see that since pretty much 10 years ago, the total labor force has been fallen, and that is also kind of less than the total population now. Significantly less. So that means also that maybe 40% of people who are in the labor force have to produce wealth and food and goods and services for nearly 60% of the rest of the population, which may be old people, which may be young people, but also just people in sort of the main age bracket. And then that means that there is a much harder burden for these people. The International Labour Office are calculating the labor force participation rate as a percentage of the total population that is aged higher than 15 years. And you see that that has come down significantly since the 1990s and is now below 2/3 of the active population. So in part, this development shows something about, how should I say, a slowdown of economic growth. It means that the burden for sustaining a non-active part of the population is increasing. And that is an important aspect in the long run for economic growth and the development of the country. As I said, the unemployment rate is very low. We hardly had any significant data until 2015, but even since then it is extremely low. And that we see that also in neighboring countries like Thailand, partially because there are no unemployment systems really, except for a very small part of employed people. And so it doesn't have the meaning that it has in more advanced industrialized countries. So we focus on this participation rate in terms of development. And I come back to that later on. Now, what matters and what is the indicator for how rich a country is or how poor a country is GDP per capita. GDP is the total production of goods and services at a given level of prices. And we can compare countries across the world in terms of GDP per capita. Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world. We see that Thailand is somewhere in the middle, slightly up from the middle there. but Myanmar is really very much down here amongst the poorest countries in the world. It had improved a little bit in recent decade through higher growth rates in economic output, but that is now clearly under threat with the new military government. So we need to understand a little bit what is the drivers of economic growth. Now, this is a big story, and of course, World Bank and IMF and others are experts on that in terms of how to foster economic growth in developing countries. But the basic elements of that are, first of all, that an increase in output is an increase in income. So if the country produces more, it means also that people get richer. The question is, what drives this increase in output? That's the dynamics of the economy. There's the long run, and there are short run elements as well. What interests us in terms of economic development is the long run, the trends. But then there are also short-term deviations due to shocks, crises, wars, and so on. But of course, we need to keep in mind that war is permanent inside Myanmar. It's a civil war that sometimes is stronger and sometimes is less. I come back to that at the end as well. But here you have some elements of GDP per capita. This is shows you two indicators. The top one that you see here is in GDP as an index of constant US dollars, and the lower one is in terms of current US dollars. So in other words, when we say in constant prices, that means that we are taking out the effect of inflation. So the index that you see here shows that there was stagnation under Ne Win's Burmese socialism. Then the slog took over and hardly made any improvement. When it switched to the SPDC, economic growth started to increase. When the curve gets a little steeper, that is a sign that economic growth is accelerating. And that is a tendency that was pretty much maintained under the NLD government, but of course has dramatically deteriorated since the coup, and I show more about that in a moment. The lower line that you find in the top panel here is in nominal terms, meaning in actual prices, current prices, but also in US dollars. And here, first of all, we see that prices and nominal GDP has increased faster than in real terms. Now that's normal, that is the same everywhere in the world because inflation is always there a bit, but when it gets much steeper, like under the SPDC, then that is a sign that inflation is also accelerating. That was also the case with the slog in the 1990s. Under the NLD government and the semi-civil government before, we see that actually prices were fairly stable, and that meant also that real growth, meaning output and income for people, was improving for everyone. Now all that is now, of course, in jeopardy. The lower panel shows you the growth rate in terms of actual real growth, not inflation. And again, you see that there is pretty much stagnation during the Ne Win period. At the end of Ne Win, there was a severe deterioration, negative growth. In 1988, it was even minus 10%. But at this moment now, after the coup in 21, it's even minus 18. So it's even nearly double as bad as it was at the end of the Ne Win regime. Under the slog, then economic growth normalized a little bit. After that, it improved, but then came down. And with economic reforms, it kind of stabilized around 5%, which was not bad. I mean, if that would have been maintained, then it would have doubled income and national wealth roughly every 15 years, and that would not be such a bad performance. But of course, with the military coup in 21, all that is now destroyed again, and we see this very severe reduction in the GDP per capita. Now, another way of looking at it is also looking at deviations from the long-run trend. So here, what you see is the top line, the orange line is the trend, long-run trend, with a special method called the Hodrick-Prescott filter that shows that in terms of GDP. And the blue line shows what the actual GDP was. Then we have the bottom, we have the green lines there. That's the deviation from the long-run trend. Now, what this picture shows us and what is interesting here is that if you look at the long-run trend, we see that during the slog period, it really stagnated. There wasn't much happening. There was even a bit higher trend under Ne Win, and then it accelerated a little bit under the SPDC period and sustained that kind of growth in the semi-civil governments. Nevertheless, there were significant deviations. We see that under the slog regime, there was a severe economic crisis where actual GDP was below the long-run trend, but in the period before it was a little bit above, but that was not sustainable. We see that under most of the military governments since '88, there has been less than long-run trend performance, so that has lowered the trend as well. And under the NLD government, the GDP grew actually faster than the trend. That was a positive thing. It would have accelerated the trend, but that now has come to a dramatic end with the military coup. So what that really shows us is that overall, the long-run trend in Myanmar is not super well performing, but that there were some signs that things could turn into something more wealth-producing, larger, faster economic development. But the military has always been blocking that and restricting economic growth and been a real blockage to that. Now, if you look at what are the factors behind it, you can say economic growth is an increase in output, which is an increase in income. And it has basically two factors. One is labor productivity, meaning output per worker. And the other one is how many workers out of the total population are participating in active production and in the economy. So these are the two important elements for growth. And we can therefore summarize that by saying per capita income growth, meaning economic development, depends on the growth of labor productivity, meaning how much output every worker is producing, multiplied by the change in the participation rate, which I have shown you before, had a long-run tendency to fall. So that has been a handicap in terms of per capita income. But probably the most important factor is labor productivity. And here we see that labor productivity has been quite high in the first decade of the 2000s. And since then has been a little bit volatile. Under the NLD, it even was shooting up again, but also came down and so on. And of course, now here the data are not up to date totally, but we know that in 2021, with the economic crisis that followed the coup, labor productivity has come down significantly. So this is in terms of real output, in terms of real GDP per capita, but economic growth is also in a way related to nominal terms, meaning an increase in prices, because we need the prices to calculate a GDP, to add up all the different things. And if the prices increase significantly, we have inflation. Inflation, of course, depends on cost, which is wages to some degree, but that is maybe not the main driver in Myanmar. And on imports, imported goods, whether it's material, raw material, energy, or whether it is investment goods and also consumer items. So the imports are an important driver of inflation in Myanmar as well, because when the Chad depreciates, it means that all imports become more important, more expensive, and with more expensive imports, that feeds into the prices for everything else. However, economic theory also tells us that all inflation is, in the end, a monetary phenomenon, meaning that it depends on monetary policy. And monetary policy in Myanmar means essentially monetization of budget deficits. During the NLD years, there was the beginning of bond market development and government issuing public debt and reducing the monetary financing of the budget deficit. That was a very positive development. It could have led to a much more vibrant economy for many reasons. But now, of course, that has gone back to the previous times. You see here how in recent months, inflation has accelerated significantly, especially since the coup. I mean, just before the coup under the last month of Aung San Suu Kyi's government, inflation was actually really very low, which is a good thing. But since then, it has gone up from below 2% or 1% up to 18% or something like this, and to a large degree related to non-food items, many of which are, of course, imported. And you see that also transport has become an important factor in this development. So these are some of the long-run things, but we can now also look at the short-run developments since the coup. Now, the World Bank has done a lot of studies in recent times, and I want to report to you some of their insights. The World Bank says that the fiscal year 2021 caused a contraction, meaning a fall, a shrinking of the economy of GDP of 18%. and that in the year that has ended in 2022 in September, there was a little bit of economic growth of 3%, but that effectively, of course, means that we're still about 15% poorer than we have been before the coup. The World Bank also says that the absence of rebound is to a large degree due to supply and demand side constraints that have an impact on economic activity. It means that partly that impact comes from COVID, but more importantly, the consequences of the coup and the rebellion against it, and that is hugely damaging to the livelihoods of people. Now, of course, you could say, well, then that means everyone should do what the SLOC does, or what the military government says one should. They want people to do, but this is wrong, because the policies that the military government is pursuing are not sustaining any economic growth. So the resistance against that are an element that on the one hand reduces growth in the short run, but on the other hand are necessary in order to change the situation in the long run and get rid of the military government. The world here you see the impact of the coup. In 2021, you had this 18% reduction in growth. You see that in the previous years, it has been much higher, above 5%, largely driven by industry and services, less by agriculture. But after the coup, everything collapsed, agriculture as well as industry, as well as services. And if it's sort of picking up a little bit again, it's mainly because of industry, but agriculture is still negatively growing. And as a consequence, you see this on the right side of this graph. It's like the long run tendency that we had before is no longer available. We are now 15% lower and poorer than we were before the coup. And this is the direct consequence of the political developments in Myanmar. We can also compare this to other countries in the region. You see here the real GDP levels forecast for 2022 relative to 2019, meaning that the little horizontal line here at 100 is what GDP was in 2019. And you see that Myanmar is significantly more than 15% below that level. We see that Thailand and Mongolia also are still a little less. This is partly a consequence of COVID, but much less reduction than in Myanmar, where the coup has had an additional effect. But we see that other countries like Vietnam and China, they all have grown significantly since 2019, despite the COVID situation. And so you can ask yourself, what is going wrong in there? Another element of that, of course, is inflation, which is increasing to 15%, while it was only 3.5% in fiscal year of 21. This forecast exceeds all the projections that were done before, close to 9%. Partly, the World Bank argues these are effects of the Ukraine war that have had an impact on global import prices for Myanmar as well. But, and I think that is a key issue, it was compounded by the ongoing Chad depreciation since the coup, which has also been related to domestic logistic constraints during the civil disobedience campaign. Of course, many supply chains have collapsed. And then the government has imposed trade restrictions, which are totally counterproductive and have prompted shortages of all kinds of items, both in terms of exports as in imports. And by taxing exports and putting barriers on exports through a licensing system, effectively the country is kind of stuck. And so inflation is increasing because of these shortages and supply side effects. And it is expected that it will continue to be high because of transport price inflation, food inflation, and these other shortages. So this is a severe restriction on the Myanmar economy, and it means that inflation will remain high. We see here how that is presently looking in terms of the short-term dynamics of year-on-year inflation. And it is much higher in reality than what the government has been expecting. Now, we need to see this also in the context of international trade. International trade really was at very low levels already in late 21. And that is partly because of COVID, yes, but also to a lot, and especially the closed border to China. But it is also because mistaken policies of exchange restrictions, foreign exchange restrictions in terms of trade license requirements, which are all totally counterproductive. As a consequence, both exports and imports have been reduced, exports by 12%, falling, and imports by 20%. But given that many of the imports are also necessary for production and therefore economic growth, you can see that in this international trade situation, economic growth is handicapped. An important element of that is always foreign exchange policies. That has always been a key vulnerability of the Myanmar economy until basically, you can say, the civil government period, starting shortly before Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD government was formed, but even during her period, foreign exchange was well managed. But before, under military rule, whether it's Ne Win or SLORC or whoever, it has always been a severe problem for the country. Now, as soon as the coup came, the managed float that existed before under NLD government was abolished. People were forced to surrender their foreign currency holdings, and that reduced the competitiveness of exports and created substantial uncertainty. But when you create uncertainty, it means you will have less investment, you will have less economic activity, and again, that contributes to a reduction in economic growth. When the managed float regime was abolished, the Central Bank of Myanmar is still fixing a reference rate, as they did in the old days under Ne Win and SLORC. But now this rate is 1,850 chat per dollar, but this is still overvalued relative to supply and demand in the market for foreign currency, creating shortages. And there has been a parallel market that has developed. In April, the Central Bank of Myanmar issued a notification whereby new and existing foreign currency deposits have to be converted. And that means that at a market rate that is 2,000 Baht a dollar. But again, this is not yet the market rate. And so it continues to sustain on the one hand, the parallel market. On the other hand, it acts like a tax on exporters who before were able to change currency at the market rate. Now they can't anymore. And that squeezes the margins of exporters and therefore reduces the capacity for exports to contribute to more economic growth. And all this limits the competitiveness of agricultural exports as well as industrial exports. And all this has contributed to the reduction in economic growth. Now here you see on the left side the Myanmar Chat exchange rates, and you see that the parallel market is significantly higher with 2,300 something above the official exchange rates that the government imposes, which is a typical sign for economic policies being out of control and not really reflecting the realities in the country, which is typically what has always happened in Myanmar under military rule. On the right side of this chart, you see also how the exchange rate in Myanmar relative to the US dollar has developed when you compare it with other countries. And you see that, I mean, when it goes up, it means effectively a depreciation of the local currency. You see that this is highly significant depreciation in Myanmar, much more than for other countries like Malaysia or Thailand. But even China, for China, we even find that it's been the opposite. China is the renminbi has become more expensive relative to the US dollar, or not more expensive, but more appreciated than the US dollar. And so it also is clearly an indicator of how much competitiveness is changing, and that these high prices through the exchange rate are effectively leading to high import prices, and therefore continue to fuel the inflation and the high cost of production in Myanmar, which means in terms of international capacities, the country is falling behind. Now, I said before that inflation depends also on money. We see here how broad money has developed over recent years, and you see that there's an acceleration in the creation of broad money in recent years. Now, one way to look at monetary policy is the interest rate, which is the price for compensating someone to give up the advantage of holding cash. And that means the interest rate is an important variable for capital markets. But when the inflation is higher than the interest rates, then lending money means you are destroying wealth. You can measure that by what's called the real interest rate, where you take nominal interest rate as charged minus the inflation rate. But what is important is to understand that Sound economics requires positive real interest rates, not too high, because if it's too high, then it's difficult to find attractive investment opportunities. But if it is negative, it means effectively everyone who's holding cash is losing out wealth. And you see here the inflation rate in Myanmar since the 1960s. It's been sometimes very high, and then there are periods where it was a bit lower. Under the semi-civil government since 2011, inflation was relatively low and was below the lending interest rate. But you see that now, since the coup, inflation has been shooting up and interest rates are down. So effectively, that means that the real interest rate has become negative again, just as it was in the slog years for many times. And with that, we have another indicator that the policies pursued by the present military government are really counterproductive in terms of economic development and capital investment. Now, having said that, the government sector is, of course, an important part of the Myanmar economy, and we need to look at public expenditure, which is the money that the government spends on public goods, which raises the question, what kind of goods? This is in the budget. I will show that in a moment. It raises also the question, what are the public goods? Who decides what the money should be spent on? And now this is totally in the hand of the military, and I will show you in a moment that it means that they are taking it all, increasing the budget for military purposes and reducing it on social services, health, and education, which are the important elements in fostering economic development. So it's all counterproductive that we find there. If we look at public spending, there's an issue of fiscal federalism in Myanmar, but at the moment, everything is totally centralized by the union government. And if one would think of alternative constitution and things like that, there would be need for some kind of federalization into regional administrations and so on. But also, one should not forget that churches and associations, religious associations and so on, they also provide some form of public goods and services. But that's a marginal thing. The question is, who decides how much spending, and then how is it financed? This is the income through taxes and fees. And in Myanmar, an important part are the state-owned enterprises. When the income is less than the expenditure, then we have a deficit. The deficit can be financed either by issuing debt, which is what the NLD government did, and that leads to the development of a capital market, bond market, financial market, which is necessary for a stable development of a proper finance sector that finances investment and economic development. This is a historic experience that in England that happened in the 17th century. It has happened in all developing countries. But in Myanmar, under military rule, before under Ne Win and the slog, but now again, most of the deficit is financed by just printing money. And that is, therefore, the fiscal position is a key question to the development of inflation, and therefore also monetary and financial stability, and ultimately it is determining to what degree financially a country is developing so that it can finance investment and economic growth. Now, since the military coup, there has been a severe deterioration in the fiscal position. Only 70% of the previously budgeted revenues were collected in 2021, while in the previous years, the revenue targets were usually met or even exceeded. So this lack of revenue, the government, military government, was not able to collect, resulted then also in declining revenues. So the government had less money to spend, and so it had to, the lack of income led also to a lack of spending, and you see that here. The black bar is the expenditure and the orange bar is the revenue. The difference is the deficit, and we see also the deficit in terms of percentage of GDP. We see that in 2019, the deficit was 3%, which was reasonably low. Then came the COVID crisis. It went up to 6.9%, nearly 7%. But in 2021, we see that the revenue really fell, and then also the spending fell, but the deficit was still close to 10%. That was very high, and it was basically financed by printing money. And then for 2022, the government had to reduce its expenditure, spending, and also the revenue was much lower. And so for 23, they are saying it could become a little more, but nobody knows if that is really true. So what the World Bank says is that budget execution worsened. That means expenditure and revenue outturns worsened in 21, declining 82 for expenditure, 70% for the revenue. So this is a very important decline in the budget capability to actually for the government to spend. And you see that in terms of expenditure here, you see that the actual outturn of the budget estimates relative to the actual performance have been usually quite stable here, but here you see a clear deterioration in terms of actual ones. And then the military government had to really think that they had to reduce significantly their expenditure as well as the revenue that was not allowing them to spend more money. So COVID, of course, was a factor, especially here in the higher budget spending. But here we see that the government is severely constrained by the fact that they don't have a lot of money anymore. So the World Bank acknowledges that the drop in budget credibility could be explained by the coup, the capacity to spend and raise revenue were negatively affected. Part of that was also a consequence of the civil disobedience movement, which had implications for public sector staffing and the payment and the collection of taxes and fees. So in other words, what the CDM was really accomplishing was it constrained the government that could no longer spend so much. But if you look at the consequences, side effects of all this, then it means really that the conditions of budget policy have been totally reversed compared to previous years. And you see this in terms of the collection, in terms of GDP, it's really down significantly in 21. And this is to a large degree due to some commercial tax that is reduced because the output has fallen so much, GDP has fallen, so less commercial tax, and also income tax has come down. I mean, all these are signs that the economy is under severe pressure and depression here. The government, the World Bank calls this military government the administration because they don't recognize it as a proper government. But they say that they have ambitious targets for 2023, but that appears very unlikely that they will accomplish that. And so they find that 2/3 of the firms are not really paying taxes. That is a very significant part. The non-payment of taxes is higher among the smaller firms, and the larger firms, they are under more strict control by the government. Sometimes they're state-owned companies and so on. But one also finds that tax compliance, meaning those who are paying taxes, is highest amongst food and beverage sector, manufacturing, in other words, those things that the government can really control. But you see here that tax compliance is very low in agriculture and ITC and things like that. Now, the non-tax revenues are a large share of total revenue. And in Myanmar, that means that it's the state economic enterprises which are contributing to the budget to an important degree, and in particular in the energy sector. You see here the revenue breakdown. You see down here the commercial tax and the income tax. All this is actually quite a small share of the total income of the government. Much bigger is other things and the contribution from state-owned enterprises, which are about 7-9%, something like that. And of course, electricity is an important part of that. Now, the problem with these state economic enterprises is that they are making losses. And because they're making losses, they cost money to the government instead of earning money for the government. And that has been particularly the case since the coup, as you can see here. And that sharpens the economic crisis in the country. A lot of that is related to electricity, related state enterprises, the gas export earnings, which are either finished or for political reasons terminated, like Total has left the country because they find the political situation unbearable. As a consequence of that, also we find that there's increasing countrywide power cuts. Now, the power cuts seem to have stabilized a little bit in recent months, but you see here that a chart for electricity outages in terms of duration per day, in terms of minutes per day. And you see that after the coup in February 21, that increased enormously. It has now come maybe on average down to the usual one, but when you have electricity cuts like that, of course, that leads to severe shortages and supply possibilities in terms of output and production and so on. And to a large degree, the power capacity is driven by suspension of LNG power plants, which is again dependent on imports, and the depreciating Chad against US dollars means that many of these or that electricity plants are no longer financially viable. So that leads to power shortages, cash shortages. The banking sector then can no longer finance these firms and so on. And that is an important part of the supply side problems that the economy has. Nevertheless, state economic enterprises are still a dominant factor in Myanmar's economy and not private sector market developments. And that is one of the big weaknesses of the Myanmar economy. And through the different military governments, one sees that there's always been a problem to mobilize tax revenue. And part of that is related to commodities and service taxes that the military has imposed. But that is a tax on imports now. There's on exports, there's taxes. So that means really that the government is shooting itself in the foot all the time. You see here tax collection as percentage of GDP since 1972. You see the long run tendency has always been under the military rule to less and less tax collection. Under the NLD, it improved a little bit, but it's far below anything that you have, say, in Thailand next door and things like that. So the deficit is high. It's gone up to over 9% in 2021. Maybe it came down a little bit this year because they reduced everything, but it will increase again. And in fact, when you compare Myanmar, which is the black line here, with lower middle income countries or East Asia performances, you see that the tax collecting inflation is much higher. You see the balances for those years here, and these years is 95, this is the slog years, and you see that during that time inflation was much higher than in other parts of the world, and this was also true in the 1980s, and it usually is related to high deficits that lead to high inflation. So why is that so? It's so because under military rule, there is no markets for debt. They are printing the money, or they are borrowing from state banks. State banks means that they get the money from the Central Bank of Myanmar. And as a consequence of that, there's more money floating around that pushes up the prices. Under the semi-civil government, there was the beginning of a treasury bond market, but now that is in jeopardy again. And so that means that the budget of the union government is the key economic determinant for the performance of the Myanmar economy. Now, what is interesting is when you look at the 23 budget plans, there is a clear tendency, increase the share for energy and defense. But at the same time, reduce spending on health, education, and social protection. This is the program of the military rule in Myanmar. And energy spending is still dominant because it's an important part, especially through the state economic enterprises. But defense spending is now 15% of the budget and is larger than allocations for health, which are only 2.8%, and education, which are 7%. Furthermore, defense has increased from 10% in the budget 21 to 12% in the budget 23. Now, I say under NLD, this was a semi-civil government because effectively we had two governments. One was Aung San Suu Kyi's government, and the other one was the military sitting in there. And that already kept the share of military spending high at 10%, which is, I mean, on some level, you could say totally ridiculous because Myanmar has no neighbors that are in any way a threat to the country. Instead, they are maintaining the civil war so that they can justify spending on it. But now they're increasing it again because, of course, they need to have the military capacity to repress the people. So you see here the budget priorities. You see this down here is the energy part, about a quarter of the budget. And then you see the defense spending is sort of gone up like this significantly, while health and so on is just a tiny fraction of everything. The projected budget declines spending on social sectors, decrease in services for health, education, and other things. And in part, that means also that education has really come down in terms of spending, partly because less students are enrolling. And that might also be part of either suspensions or civil disobedience movements and the unrest that is happening in the country. So in fact, I think the single most important factor that sustains the military and at the same time blocks further possibilities of improving the economic situation in Myanmar is the civil war. And the World Bank also shows the index for conflict intensity. We see that under NLD government that had come down significantly. I show you that in a second again. But now, since the coup in 21, conflict intensity has enormously increased by nearly 350 times as much as before. How do we see this? Well, look at these charts here. You see that here the first chart here shows conflict intensity in May 2019. It then even fell because some of these areas in Chin State and Kachin and so on, they were starting to stop. So November 2020, this is June 20 or May 2020, this is November 2020. We had the lowest level of conflict intensity in the country for probably, I don't know, since the 1960s or something like that. And then 21, we have the coup in February. You see that in May, how the conflict is flaring up everywhere dramatically, and even getting worse. In 2022, you see that now it is gone all the way down Mon State, it's all the way up here in Kachin State, it's at the center as well. So clearly the country is in fire. And unless the civil war is brought down, which is what Aung San Suu Kyi tried to achieve, but the Tatmadaw prevented it from happening, nothing will really ever become normal, and therefore economic development will not really happen. So, to conclude my outlines, and then we could have a bit of a discussion, we have a very sad state of affairs. All the reforms that have happened in recent years have been reversed. And this means that the likelihood that the economic situation will further deteriorate is very high, partly because of incompetent economic policies, which create high uncertainty for investors. It creates low income, low consumption, low savings, and there will be an increase in violence from the side of the Tatmadaw. One side effect of that, of course, is probably also that there will be an increasing number of refugees into neighboring countries. And that is also a form of international instability. The question there is, to what degree and how much can neighboring countries absorb these refugees? In Thailand, there's about 2 million Burmese living and working in the country. Some of them legal, some of them illegal. But the question is, if there's a huge additional inflow, how will that impact on Thailand and on the relations between Thailand and Myanmar? The Chinese border is closed. We have seen also inflows, huge inflows into Bangladesh because of the Rohingya story, but also into India recent years, since the coup. So all that means that Myanmar is really becoming a destabilizing force in the region, which will also have further international complications.